Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Garbaugust 2024, Garbaugust 3D. This is an event, of course, a famous BookTube event by now, created by Ollie at Criminali, where we read garbage in the month of August. We read trash in the month of August, which has raised in my own mind a whole bunch of categorical questions about what is and is not trash, what do we expect from it or what we don't, what are we legitimately entitled to find disappointing in it, and what aren't we? All kinds of boring Jesuitical questions like that I just love. I love kicking around concepts like that as much as I love just sinking in with the trash. Now, some of the trash that I have read so far in August, I've read a lot of trash in August. I've read more than my share of trash in August because quite a bit of the stuff that I read just regularly is trash. It just doesn't know it is and would argue that it isn't. Uh, so it feels like, to me, it feels like Garbaugust is a lot older than just 10 days. But I've read a lot of trash, but I'm also trying to triangulate on the right kind of trash, the enjoyable kind of trash. I haven't always succeeded in that. You never know. You can never tell. It also, I would imagine, changes from person to person. We often talk, for instance, about a writer engaging in the everyday prejudices of his time, so that you're reading along in a 1940s piece of trash and you're enjoying how trashy it is, and then all of a sudden characters start throwing around racial epithets and it's not quite so enjoyable anymore. Even when you make allowances for the time period, it's still just not quite as enjoyable anymore. It's not prudishness, it's just, especially to the extent that you start to wonder how much the author really liked those kinds of epithets, it lessens the innocent enjoyment of the stuff. The counteraction is no better in the 21st century, where those racial epithets aren't there anymore, but where there aren't editors there anymore either. So the trash you get from, for instance, indie published on Kindle Unlimited is often no more enjoyable because there has to be a certain amount of baseline competency in what you're reading, even if it's trash. I don't know. You can tell I muddy the waters, and I had a couple of muddy experiences recently that caused me to raise all of these questions again: what we consider to be trash and what we don't. And that yesterday caused me to mention, in my Garbaugust video yesterday, it caused me to mention one particular book, this book, The Synthetic Men of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I said, even in the video, I said, I'm sure that I'm going to be bombarded by people in emails saying, well, you know what you have to read tonight, and you have to reread Synthetic Men of Mars. I've got this here in these old Del Rey paperbacks that have the painting on the front and back. These were the last mass market run of Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I believe they are the last mass market run of Edgar Rice Burroughs that will ever happen, which is weird to say. I'm glad that ERB went out on such a strong note, but it's still weird to say. I can't imagine it ever happening again. I can't imagine Tarzan or Edgar Rice Burroughs ever, or John Carter of Mars, which is what this is, ever being reprinted in mass market paperbacks anymore. I could be wrong. I'd like to be wrong about that. But these novels are not Tarzan. These are about a man named John Carter who transports himself somehow to Mars. Only it's not the Mars that exists in the real world. It's the Mars that existed in the fervent imaginations at the turn of the 20th century, when Percival Lowell was seeing striations on the planet through a primitive telescope and saying they look like canals. So maybe Mars is a dying planet. Maybe its water is disappearing from its surface, and so the desperate inhabitants are building canals and waterways to try to maximize what little water there is left. That fired the imaginations of the whole of the Western world, including Edgar Rice Burroughs, and that is the Mars that his John Carter goes to. It's a primitive world, but it's a living world. It's full of cities. It's full of different races of people and monsters and whatnot, and not like the world that actually existed the whole time that Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing these books, which is incredibly cold and lethally irradiated. So no life on the surface of Mars, no water on the surface of Mars in millions and millions and millions, maybe billions of years. Once upon a time, these stories would have been possible on Mars. Once upon a time, Mars was a blue sky, green water planet. Amazing to me, just endlessly amazing to me to think about that, to think about that world, to think about how if you were able to go back to the, I don't even know, the Cretaceous period here on Earth and stop yourself from being killed and eaten by a millipede that's 10 feet long. Just stop yourself from doing that. Find a nice rocky outcrop and bring with you just an ordinary backyard telescope. You could look up and see a very different Mars from the one you see today. But that hasn't been true in a long time. It wasn't true when Burroughs was writing these books. And the Mars that he sends John Carter to is different in another way as well from Earth. Of course, Mars has a much lighter gravity. So John Carter, when he goes to Mars, is a Superman. He can leap huge distances. He's much stronger than any other bipedal creature on Mars. John Carter is also a little weird in and of himself. Before he gets to Mars, he is apparently immortal. He has no memory of a childhood. As far as he's concerned, he's always been in his early 30s. A hale and healthy, white-skinned, black-haired fighting man who has known warfare across centuries. So that adds to the mix. It doesn't add much to the mix because ordinary humans also go to Mars. But one in particular, Ulysses S. Paxton, is an ordinary Earthman who transports to Mars to have adventures of his own in a Edgar Rice Burroughs novel called The Mastermind of Mars, in which Ulysses S. Paxton goes up against a Martian scientist called Ras Thavas. And Mastermind of Mars is a lean book. It's economically plotted, quite good. And in yesterday's Garbaugust video, I mentioned that, I was agonizing about things like this. I named this specifically, the Synthetic Men of Mars. What do you do with the Synthetic Men of Mars? It's obviously garbage. I know, we shouldn't tell Michael K. Vaughan that, but it's obviously garbage. But I love it. I've been reading it forever, just forever, for the better part of a century. I have been reading and rereading this book and these books. In John Carter, I like far more than I like Tarzan, far more than I like anything that Edgar Rice Burroughs did. And that adds a patina, that kind of sentimental patina to something that makes it a little hard to call it trash. I'm perfectly willing to admit that. But I mentioned it a few times in yesterday's video, and I knew already that I was setting myself to get bullied into going back and rereading it. I don't need much in the way of prodding to go back and reread this, so I did. I went and reread this last night for God knows how many times. I literally have no idea how many times I've read this book. Or any of the John Carter books. Or any of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I always say that I like John Carter more than anything else that he wrote. But I have read Tarzan and the Castaways 100 times. Tarzan and the Lion Men 100 times. I'm sure that I have. Sometimes sometimes nothing will quite do like Edgar Rice Burroughs. So I went back to this book. And I consider myself a little bit consoled in a way, in an odd kind of melancholy way, a little bit consoled by the fact that I wasn't the only person who thought this was trash in its own day. Editors didn't quite know what to make of this thing. Edgar Rice Burroughs, by this point, was an extremely successful author. He was a by name. He'd been writing profitably for decades. And he, as was the way in the time, in 1939, he decided to serialize this story before he made a novel out of it, before he made a book out of it, to maximize, what you would earn from something. And the first two editors that he approached read the first batches and didn't want it. As far as I know, I'm not as knowledgeable on Edgar Rice Burroughs' life as, for instance, Michael K. Vaughan would be. But as far as I know, that was the very first time in the flush of his success that Edgar Rice Burroughs had ever heard that kind of reaction from an editor of no thanks. I get a whiff of it and no thanks. And I think part of that, again, I would yield to more knowledgeable heads on the subject, but I would think that part of that is because By 1939, Edgar Rice Burroughs was starting to feel a little bit antiquated. Science fiction proper had taken off by then. The reading world was younger. Uh, Edgar Rice Burroughs was very much a product of the 30s, the 20s even. So I don't doubt that it would have been awkward for him to try to sell a John Carter novel in 1939. No matter how a publisher today would give millions for such a thing from Edgar Rice Burroughs, but at the time, I don't doubt that was hard to do. So that's one thing. It was that those editors didn't really. He had to go, I think, to 2 or 3 magazines before he got somebody to say yes, and they didn't exactly pay him a king's ransom. A little more than $1,000 for the serialization rights to this thing. And then in 1940, the book came out, and was not universally beloved, even by John Carter of Mars, even by Barsoom fans. It wasn't universally beloved, and that's because it's not all that good. It's not all that good. For instance, it's nowhere near as good as Mastermind of Mars, where Raz Thavas makes his first appearance. Raz Thavas, the reason I keep mentioning this nerdy loser's name is because he shows up again in this book. Because John Carter of Mars, by this point, he is an institution on Mars. He is no longer a weird stranger. He is the warlord of Mars. He's the lord of helium. And he is the husband of the incomparable Dejah Thoris. And she is injured. As the action of this book begins, she is injured and needs extremely specific, brilliant help of a kind that only Raz Thavas can provide. So John Carter and a member, a Padwar, a lieutenant in his guard, Vor Daj, a dashing young man named Vor Daj, they have to go and find Raz Thavas. And he has relocated, of course. If you're a disgraced mad scientist, you do relocate. He has relocated because he's been going about his usual mad scientist stuff. Specifically, he's been creating synthetic men, monstrous, lumpish, misshapen synthetic creatures called Hormads. And when John Carter and Vor Daj, our hero, narrates the book, John Carter is just an extra here. That happens a lot of Barsoom novels. Edgar Rice Burroughs doesn't. John Carter is always a key point in most of them. Maybe not Mastermind of Mars, because you've got another Earthman there to take the heavy load. But I get the impression that Burroughs very much wanted to tell just lots and lots of stories set on Barsoom, and they didn't want to be necessarily shackled to this one character, who brings his melodrama along with him. It's hard to raise the stakes elsewhere if you've got a Superman in the middle of your story. But it turns out that Raz Thavas, his Hormads are not happy. They want more. They want to rule all of Barsoom. And they aren't, if he is objecting to that, if he wants them to be under his thumb, well, then they'll imprison him. And they imprison John Carter and Vor Daj as well. And also in the course of the plot, naturally, the dashing Vor Daj does 2 things that you're expecting, and they happen like clockwork in this book. There's nothing in here that is unpredictable, except for the very end. I'll get to that. There's a thing at the end that the editors that turned this down originally, I'm sure they didn't read the ending. Or God knows what they would have made of it. They'd have turned it down even faster, I think. But 2 things happen to Vor Daj. One is that he has his brain transferred into the body of a Hormad, so it's himself, and he's noble and self-sacrificing and whatnot, and chivalric, but he's in this huge, misshapen body. And 2 is that he falls in love. He falls in love with a beautiful young woman named Janai. That is the 2 of them on the cover there. And of course, she can't love him as long as he's brutish and misshapen, right? That can't happen. So they all have to work against the Hormads. And eventually, John Carter and Raz Thavas escape. And that's bad for the little island where these monsters are living, because John Carter has all the resources of helium at his disposal, the greatest city on a dying planet. Fleets of airships. Armies of soldiers. If you allow him to escape and he gets back to his power base, you're going to lose. And so the breakneck action of the book at the end becomes, well, what about this doomed love affair? Is Vor Daj going to sacrifice himself to save Janai, to save his warlord, to save everybody? Because what's the point of going on if you're in a hulking, misshapen body? Or is he maybe going to get his brain transferred back to his own body? We've been told at a couple of points in this book, but especially there's one point later on, very late in the book, where Edgar Rice Burroughs very nicely plays on the cliffhanger elements of the story to make the reader think, oh no, his original body's been destroyed. He's stuck in this lumpish, misshapen, synthetic body forever. And you don't know that that's 100% true. Is he going to end up back in his own body and therefore able to bend the knee and put a ring on Janai's finger? Is he going to be able to do that or not? Or is he going to do a heroic sacrifice? Knowing Edgar Rice Burroughs, he only knows how to do one of those two things. So it's going to be one of those two things. But there's a climactic action at the end of the book, which is kind of satisfying. I understand there have been a lot of critics of this book, and I understand where they're coming from. It isn't particularly good at all. It isn't particularly good. When it isn't stodgy, it's, oh, come on. And you don't even, Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing science fantasy, really, romantic science fantasy, so he wasn't really needing to stretch the latest scientific principles like the science fiction authors at the time were starting to do with increasing frequency in 1940. But even so, if you're writing science fantasy, and even so at chapter 10 or whatever, you haul out some concept and your readers go, oh, come on. That's bad. That's really bad. You don't want that to happen. And that does happen in this book. But there's one concept that he concludes the book with. The thing that is at the center of the climax of this novel. I don't want to spoil the climax for you, but there's something horrifying at the end of this book. A bubbling, seething mass of synthetic flesh. Not synthetic beings, but just a giant lava flow of misshapen synthetic flesh that's constantly sprouting, grasping arms or sprouting contorted, screaming faces that then get reabsorbed back into the mass. It's like something out of John Carpenter's The Thing. Wouldn't be surprised if John Carpenter actually read this book as an impressionable teenager. I always forget that how strange that development is at the end of this book. I always forget it. How weird it is, genuinely weird, even for Edgar Rice Burroughs. I have heard it said, I have been in late night bull sessions about this book, where some people who've then gone on to become fairly good at publishing science fiction criticism have said that that particular element of this book, more than anything else, shows that in 1939, 1940, Edgar Rice Burroughs was starting to strain a little at the conventions of science fantasy and maybe would have gone in a different direction, either to horror or to science fiction. I don't know that I believe that. I think he just got carried away in a good way. That conclusion really does redeem an otherwise a little bit sleepy book. But still, I had to read it, and I had to reread it for Garbaugust. What would Garbaugust be without a Barsoom story? I've never been a really big fan of Synthetic Men of Mars, and as a greater heresy to John Carter fans, because it's a much, much better book, I've also never been a big fan of Chessmen of Mars. Chessmen of Mars, there's no way you can call it the same kind of trash that this is. No way at all. I've never been a big fan of either one of them, but I was happy to revisit this. Absolutely happy to do so, and happy to do it in this old paperback. Especially since I realized it really dawned on me when I was finishing it, that how weird it is that I lived to see the end of that era. Synthetic Men of Men, John Carter and Synthetic Men of Mars has had a long, trashy, paperback, pulpy history, and that history is over. That's weird to think about, that no one's ever going to do this again. But still, I was happy to go back to Barsoom, but I'm going to resist. Our Garbaugust is not old. It's only 10 days old. I'm going to resist the urge to go back to very familiar ground for garbage. I'm going to resist the urge to do that. I'm not going to read a Doc Savage novel at all for Garbaugust 2024. So maybe I'll go to Kindle Unlimited tonight, just to reset the bearings. I'll let you know. I will report back. Thank you, BookTube.